Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Knockout Podcast, episode 60. A couple of weeks off owing to exams, new jobs, and whisper it quietly, just not a whole lot of good fights. But we are back after a couple of weeks hiatus, and we've got still not a lot to talk about in terms of action-packed fights that have happened, bar Ponzinibbio-Baeza, which we'll get onto. But we do have a pretty tasty UFC 263 at the weekend with 2 title fights and quite a lot of other action on the card. I'm Ben, and as ever, I'm joined by Jack. Jack, how are you doing down in the sunny south?
Doing pretty good. I'm enjoying it. It's getting hotter. It feels like summer is here. So that's nice. I'm glad to be back with some good fights actually, because as you said, it has been a few weeks, and there's not been a lot of great fights in that time. So no, glad that up and coming we've got some fun stuff.
Well, let's hop into it straight away. I guess the place to start would be this weekend's fight's just gone, although technically we didn't review the Font Garbrandt card, but that is so far in the rearview mirror that it doesn't really warrant talking about. Let's just focus on the ones from this week. Jairzinho, actually, we won't start the main event. We'll work our way up there. Santiago Ponzinibbio, Miguel Baeza?
It's Miguel. We go with Miguel.
An instant fight of the night, fight of the month, maybe even fight of the year contender. Just a crazy back and forth. There was certainly questions in my mind about Ponzinibbio after that fight against Li Jingliang about sort of what state he'd come back into, and certainly Baeza isn't, the tip top of the welterweight division, but certainly a guy coming in with a lot of form and a lot of hype around him. I mean, we'll get into the fight as a whole, but just how impressive was it for you from Ponzinibbio? Had that time out, such a long time out, then had a bad return to action, but has bounced back in very impressive fashion here.
Yeah, I think it is a concern. I think it's probably still true that Ponzinibbio has essentially sat out most of his prime, and he's probably now out of it. But when he looked to kind of be peaking in his career, which is now like a few years ago, like around the Magny fight, which is, I want to say, like 2018 or something like that. Magny was 2018 November. That's crazy. So nearly 3 years ago, basically, he looked to kind of be peaking. And then he's just sat out for 2.5 years. And they look to probably be his best years that he's kind of just been on the sidelines for. So that's always disappointing, that realistically his prime, he never really got it. Despite coming back and looking, I'd say in the Li Jingliang fight, he looked basically just like rusty, like ring rust, basically. Like he was kind of nervous about counters and wasn't willing to kind of like pull the trigger, and in that ended up getting himself countered because of that. And then also in the first round in this looked somewhat similar, just a little unwilling to kind of commit to his shots and commit to kind of pressuring. But then got the first round out of the way, moving on to the fight now. Got the first round out of the way, and then was able to kind of like settle in and feel a bit more comfortable, I think, for the second and third rounds.
Yeah, definitely. I think certainly one thing for me is that first you mentioned, settled in. Baeza certainly strong with the leg kicks, but I think the archetypal Ponzinibbio jab really came into its own in that second and third, and I think you could see Baeza's rhythm was quite sort of upset by that jab. He didn't fire off the leg kicks with the same frequency and potency, and sort of struggled to wrestle back the tempo as Ponzinibbio sort of settled into that fight. Certainly, as you said in the later rounds. But yeah, a really good performance from him, and just a classic of a third round.
Yeah. Yeah, like as you said, the jab was like the key, really. Which I think that it was mentioned on the broadcast, like Baeza was having success kicking, kind of like counter kicking Ponzinibbio's jab in the first round. But second and third rounds, Ponzinibbio feints more with it. And he also doubles up and even, I think, triples up on it sometimes. So in the first round, where he couldn't really get the jab going, he was able to in the second round due to the feints and due to the kind of just really committing to it with doubles. And then, yeah, like in the third round, it really was kind of like just back and forth, each swinging at each other. And something like, yeah, really, really good action. Ponzinibbio started to like kick Baeza's legs as well, I think, in the second and third, which he had fairly good success with when he did that as well, which he's been a fairly good leg kicker for a while. Like in the Magny fight, he really beat up Magny with leg kicks. So I don't know why he didn't really go to that earlier. Again, it was a bad first round for him, I think. But yeah, Ponzinibbio had quite a lot of success in the pocket as well, I think, kind of countering over the top of Baeza's jabs and then following up with left hooks quite consistently, which I thought was nice that he started to add that in as the fight got late. So yeah, I think that, well, yeah, basically just a solid third round, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I thought it was as you said, I think you basically covered it all well. He just really sort of settled into it, got his rhythm, that jab, everything sort of seemed to stem from that jab, and a really just a really impressive comeback, especially after how that first round went. You could see him sort of, it would have been understandable if he'd have, slid to a sort of 30-27 defeat from there, because that seemed like the way the fight was going.
Or even getting finished based on the first round was highly possible.
Certainly, yeah. I mean that lead left leg was really getting beaten up. So a really great turnaround from him. The question marks over how sustainable is fighting like that are going to be, especially if he's to try and mix it with some of the guys up at the top. I mean, maybe I think up at the top feels a bit too much and perhaps out of reach, but certainly if he's to mix it in and around those rankings, I think there's positive signs, but also there's still going to have to be a bit of refinement and easing off of that ring rust. But I mean, if he's going to fight like that, he's not going to struggle to be in fun fights, and I'm sure the UFC will be booking him in fights that can draw that out of him.
Yeah, no, I pretty much fully agree with that. I think that, as I said, I think he's probably set out his prime, which means that I don't think he'll be like getting top 5 really again, top 10 at a push maybe. So yeah, I don't think he'll be in like the title picture, but I think he'll still be a fairly interesting kind of action fighter, and like he'll always be in like fairly exciting fights, I think, going forward. If he can and he seems to have like shaken off like the ring rust now, and like he's got over that. So like going forward, I think he'll be able to like from the get-go kind of put out his best work. But no, something like that's basically I've thought of like maybe a year or two, like kind of as these two people's paths, I haven't said the names yet, but when I say them, you'll know. As these two people's paths probably cross, I think that a Santiago Ponzinibbio Vicente Luque fight somewhere down the road would be absolute fireworks. So yeah, as like Luque probably is kind of peaking and reaches kind of the limit, I feel, where he can get to, and then is like kind of on the downslope of his career, and if Ponzinibbio can keep it up for a few more years, they can probably cross paths, say 2-3 years down the road, and I think we'll be in for a lot of fun then.
Honestly, let's just make it now. It didn't make any sense, but I want it now.
Rankings wise, it makes no sense, but it would be fun.
That would be great. Well, we can all dream of that. Elsewhere on the card, I mean, we'll just talk about the two heavyweight co-main and main. Marcin Tybura, Walt Harris, Marcin Tybura getting it done inside the first round, finishing Walt Harris off in very similar fashion to how Alistair Overeem did He's now on a good five fight win streak, although did get outstruck in the first round against Greg Hardy, and no one should forget that. For Walt Harris, I mean, got finished exactly the same way that he did in the Overeem fight, in a fight that against Volkov, where there was no takedown threat. He got handedly outstruck on the feet. I don't really know where his future lies, but certainly a good win for Marcin Tybura, and probably catapults him up to 8th in the rankings, as it seems to say. So he's going to be mixing it up with some of the guys up at the top of the division.
Yeah, it was kind of like a typical Walt Harris fight, really, or what's come to be in some ways a typical Walt Harris fight. It is that I think the term glass cannon is very applicable to Walt Harris. He is a kill or be killed kind of guy, and we got the glimpse of that in the Overeem fight. We got the glimpse of that here, and it's disappointing. Like, he did come out and say, like, the big focus, he said, kind of going into this was that he'd really kind of tried to work on his cardio to try and avoid that. But I don't think it's necessarily cardio issues that were getting him in trouble. It's I think he does try and kind of, once he's got someone hurt, that's all he can think about, and he really kind of overcommits for it. And really, not going to say no matter how conditioned he is, because it will help, but even if he gets a lot more conditioned, he's still going to very often end up kind of like completely blowing all he's got, trying to finish the guy in that first round. And then also is the obvious glaring grappling issues, which have kind of made themselves known fairly recently as well.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend that he's picked himself up in. Yeah, the glass cannon description is certainly apt. I mean, he's still sort of apparently 11th in the rankings, which is interesting, but not great from him. For Marcin Tybura, another good win. Obviously, he knows where his strengths lie. He knows where he's going to win those fights. I'm not sure how much further I can see him progressing up these up the heavyweight ladder, but he's got himself in a position whereby he probably merits mixing it with one of the guys in that sort of top half a dozen.
Yeah, which is in a way strange, because Tybura, I mean, he's 35, he's not that old, but really, if you kind of like look at his career, he seems to be kind of peaking. Like, he seems to be like getting to his best work now. So although I suppose the last fight he did just beat Greg Hardy, as you said, didn't have a particularly good first round, but then went on to finish him, which is always nice. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where Tybura goes from here. I suppose heavyweights do have a kind of like longer shelf life. They do have their peaks later in their careers, or certainly later in age. So yeah, I think that he does warrant a kind of like, certainly, I mean, he's ranked number 8, so certainly a top 10 guy. And then gets one more win, he could be mixing it up with the top 5. So like, I don't know, like, he's not a remarkable fight. Tybura is not a remarkable fighter even by heavyweight standards, so I'm not like particularly interested in him. So like, I'll watch him fight, but I'm not like, oh, I can't wait to see what Tybura does. But it's nice to see a guy kind of improve and go on a good streak kind of when he's getting on a bit.
Indeed. Main event time. Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus Augusto Sakai, ending 4 minutes and 59 seconds into the very first round. I mean, I was looking up the striking stats on the UFC website. Augusto Sakai landing 3, Jairzinho Rozenstruik landing 16. I don't know how many of those 16 came in the last 10 seconds in that finishing flurry. Safe to say, thankfully, the job got done in that first round. because there was not a lot of evidence to suggest that either of them had, well, at least Jairzinho Rozenstruik had picked up his activity. There was a lot of circling. I was surprised. I thought there might be a bit more forward pressure from Sakai, but I guess maybe fearful of that Jairzinho Rozenstruik power that did ultimately finish him off. But a very timid first round, which you sort of come to associate with Rozenstruik, but he did get the job done in sort of typical Biggie Boy style.
Yeah, I think it was kind of, the first round was, I think that a little bit, like, he picked it up a little bit. I think that more than anything due to who he was facing, though, compared to someone like Garn, who's able to pressure him and kind of keep him at length. Tabora really wasn't able to get anything going, so kind of Rozenstruik could just kind of take the quick kicks at his legs, and then kind of like try to set up the right hand. But yeah, I think there was a little more activity, but mostly due to kind of circumstance more than anything like Rozenstruik changing anything. But yeah, basically Sakai couldn't get anything going at all, was probably fearful of counters coming back the other way. Had probably, like, in the few bursts early on that Rozenstruik had, I think Sakai probably recognized the speed that Rozenstruik had, and was fearful of that combined with the power. Really just couldn't get himself in, and then kind of luckily the knockout came, and we didn't have to suffer through 4 more rounds. Although it was I think that's maybe a bit harsh, but it's okay. It was all right.
Indeed. Yeah, I'd be interested to see what happened. I mean, I can't really offer much more analysis than that, but it'll be interesting to see where Rozenstruik goes. I mean, he seems just to be sort of like flip-flopping between, facing people sort of below him in that sort of like 6 to 12, winning, and then trying to crack into the top 6 and sort of failing to do so.
Yeah.
I don't know what's next for him. I'm trying to think of people who aren't booked. I mean, the obvious guy that sort of springs to mind feels like Curtis Blades, and I don't really want to see how that fight goes, because I feel like it's probably going to be similar to sort of Blades Volkov. But yeah, it's I need to see sort of more with Rozenstruik. It's like, for a guy who's got clearly a big kickboxing background, there just seems to be a complete unwillingness, and it does take 2 to tango, and Sakai was, as you say, not perhaps the most willing partner to initiate stuff, but I think there's such an unwillingness from him to at least try and draw out the counters. I'm perfectly fine with him being a counter striker, but in turn you've also got to try and draw out those counters, and I'm not sure he does that well enough, or at least as well as he could do.
True. So, yeah.
But yeah, we will see. There's plenty of fights in the future for him to try and work on that, and maybe that stuff he had worked on but didn't really get to bring into action because of Sakai's inactivity. Right. Well, I think that's enough of those sort of mediocre fights. Although no disrespect to Baeza Ponzinibbio, that was a
really good
cracker. Let's have a quick flick over to 263. I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of names. Before we jump into sort of I guess maybe the top sort of 3, top 4, what's one that's speaking to you on the prelims that might be one to watch out for?
So for me, the probably main one on the prelims would be, the headliner of the prelims would be Drew Dober versus Brad Riddell. Drew Dober bouncing back after the kind of like being consistently smothered and then kind of getting his head squeezed in what was a weird triangle choke against Islam Makhachev, arm triangle. So yeah, he's kind of recovering from that kind of mental blow against facing a smothering wrestler to now come out and face one of the more seasoned kind of strikers of the division, although not necessarily seasoned in MMA, but having a quite substantial kickboxing background. So in a fight that will probably favour Dober more, at least compared to the Makhachev fight, but one that I still don't think he'll quite be able to kind of like put it together enough in order to get the win. But I certainly think will be very exciting for as long as it lasts.
I mean, although Riddell didn't get to the cage for his Gillespie fight, I think both of them in training for that will be sick of the thought of fighting a guy that's going to be constantly jumping at their knees. So I expect a sort of truce at the weigh-ins that there is to be no takedowns. This certainly promises to be a really good one. You've got Evloev Dawoodu opening up the prelims, which is certainly one to look out for as well. Elsewhere on the prelims, Lauren Murphy, Joanne Coldwood, which probably feels like a number one contender for Valentina Shevchenko at the women's flyweight. Eric Anders and Britain's Darren Stewart running it back after their no contest a few months ago.
I forgot that this is that's a rematch. Cool.
That'll be an interesting one. I think Anders was pretty handedly beating Stewart in the first one, so it'll be interesting to see what changes Darren Stewart can make. Main card, Paul Craig, Jamal Hill. I am forever bamboozled by the character that is Paul Craig. I mean, made a sort of, last sort of 2018 to 2019 was just fighting these sort of like guys who came in for their debuts and were just being fed to him, and he was sort of beating one, not beating the other, pulling guard. I mean, beat Ankalaev in the last minute. Beat Kennedy Nzechukwu with pretty much a similar move, pulling guard and managing to get the triangle choke. Has been on a pretty decent run as of late, which saw him go 3-0-1, albeit two of those against a pretty depleted Shogun Rua, and others against Vinicius Moreira and Antigulov, who aren't certainly the creme de la creme. But he now finds himself on the fringes of the light heavyweight rankings, which probably says more about the light heavyweight rankings than it does about Paul Craig. But he has been showing some improvements, I think, at least. He comes in against Jamal Hill, who got a very decent knockout against OSP, 8-0. I don't really know whether I have any thoughts on where this one goes, but this does feel like a pretty obvious striker versus grappler, and if this fight stays on the feet for 15 minutes, I don't see a way in which Paul Craig's striking gets the job done. But equally, if Paul Craig can lure Jamal Hill into his world on the floor, then it could be a pretty quick night for Paul Craig.
Yeah, I think Paul Craig fights are always at least funny, and occasionally, like, I think he is a good kind of underdog to root for. I do enjoy Paul Craig fights just from like the can he pull it off this time again kind of standpoint. So no, it'll be fun enough, I think.
No, not Demian Maia. Skipping the gun there. Paul Craig is always
going from one great of grappling to another.
Exactly. Exactly. Paul Craig will certainly
in the same league. Yeah.
Certainly entertaining. And he's actually a pretty funny bloke if you can get past that thick Scottish accent. As you said, moving from one grappling savant to another. Demian Maia, who I thought had retired following his loss against Gilbert Burns, or I thought at least it was his intention to retire. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was the lack of crowds that perhaps kept him going. But he fights Bilal Muhammad, who of course had a short notice. Was it a short notice fight against Leon Edwards, or was it? I can't even remember the circumstances around that fight. But regardless,
I think it was. I feel like Leon Edwards was scheduled to face someone else, but I can't remember.
It was supposed to be
Hamzat Chimaev, I think.
It was Chimaev, of course, yes. Yeah, Bilal Muhammad came in to fight Leon Edwards, as we'll discuss later on. Had that pretty nasty, well, I say pretty nasty, very nasty eye poke, which ended the fight in a no contest. He comes in against Demian Maia. I mean, this could be a very interesting one. You know, we know how Bilal Muhammad likes to fight. You know, the pressure. He will be sort of pushing the fight forwards. But equally, he's got to be careful because, you know, much like the Paul Craig guard, there is a certain level of threat. Well, a lot of a level of threat if Demian Maia is able to get his claws around you.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly a bit more dangerous than Paul Craig, I will say. And just has a game that over the years he's kind of really made work for MMA very nicely. Obviously getting on now, like certainly far past his best, Demian Maia, but still very dangerous, particularly in the first round. Outside of that, he can fade fairly hard. But really in that first round, it's no secret what he's going to try and do. He's going to try and get to your back as quickly as possible. And very often, like a surprising amount, even at the age of what seems to be about 400, he's still succeeding in that quite consistently. So, yeah, I've really liked Demian Maia, have done for years. So I hope he can kind of like one last choke before he goes out, really. But yeah, Bilal Muhammad also fairly fun guy as well. So yeah, kind of it is mostly going to be about in that first round, not letting Maia kind of press you towards the cage, but also not overcommitting in order so you don't run onto kind of like reactive shots as well. And then he'll also probably try and pull you into his kind of like half guard sweep game as well, which he does very well. So a lot to look out for Bilal Muhammad in the first round. Outside of that, I think that he should really be able to, on the feet, kind of put a bit of a beating on Maia kind of going late. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, it should be a fun fight.
Certainly. Next on the card, as I mentioned, was Bilal Muhammad's former opponent, Leon Edwards, who fights in quite a bizarre fight, Nate Diaz. This was scheduled for UFC 262 and was supposed to be a 5-round co-main event. I am trying to find out whether it is still scheduled for 5 rounds. Wikipedia seems to suggest that it might be, saying the different date, the pairing will retain its original status, marking the first time in UFC history that a non-title bout other than main event has been scheduled for 5 rounds. That seems to hint to me that it's still 5 rounds. I don't know whether that's the case. I haven't found anywhere that can confirm it. 3 rounds or 5. This seems like a great fight for Leon Edwards in the sense that he's always struggled for mainstream casual appeal, if you like, and Nate Diaz is you know, bar McGregor and maybe Khabib. Perhaps Nate Diaz is perhaps one of the most sort of casual names in terms of brand, some name recognition. So it offers him a great sort of introduction to a wider market, but also crucially, it seemed like a bit of a layup from a fight matchup point of view. You know, Diaz is a guy that we haven't really seen fight regularly, and against high enough opposition. Well, I guess he has fought good opposition, but certainly not put on the good performances against sort of stylistic matchups similar to Edwards that makes you feel like if Edwards fights his fight, this is one that he can really thrive in.
Yeah, I think that it is a good opportunity for Leon Edwards, but also one that I think is difficult for him to, in a sense, really get like a good win, because like maybe it's just me, but like he's so expected to kind of just really batter Nate, and Nate shouldn't really have much for him. That anything other than like blowing him out the water is like seems like a bit of a disappointment. And like to make that kind of like tougher, Nate Diaz, despite I think getting considerably slower in the last few years and like deteriorating in many ways, is still ungodly tough. And Leon Edwards isn't a particularly prolific finisher. So kind of adding that together, I think it could like be a fairly difficult one for Leon Edwards to look good in. And honestly, his probably best kind of like chance at a finish is probably through cuts again, which like the Diaz fans will whine and complain about if that happens. So again, also not like a great look for Edwards to a degree. So it's an interesting one. Like it is a layup, I would say, and it is a good opportunity, but also it does have that kind of like factor of it's difficult to look good in it.
Yeah, I think those elbows against Diaz's face, which is certainly not, which certainly very partial to a cut, could be.
It is
one of those ways. It'll be interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think Leon Edwards, sort of clever pressure, is good clinch work. You know, he showed in that Bilal Muhammad fight that, you know, I think his striking has improved certainly from range. I think this is one that he will be very confident. And I think a lot of people are. I think I saw he's minus 400 favor or something. So I think the bookies recognise that as well. But as you say, yeah, it could be one that, you know, a 50-45 or a 30-27, depending on whether it's 3 or 5 rounds, might not be enough to satisfy. But, you know, it certainly will be a bigger market, and hopefully he can get the job done. Right, let's move on to the 5 rounders. That could not be the case, but certainly the title fights.
I'm going to assume that Edwards Diaz is a 5 rounder. I think that they put that on as like a big kind of like showpiece. Oh, this is history, whatever. I think they'd keep it. So
I would imagine so.
5 rounder.
But certainly the first title fight of the night, co-maining Deiveson Figueiredo, Brandon Moreno. The rematch, I should say, after their majority draw UFC 256 closing out 2020. I mean, one of, if not the fight of the year, and that's certainly up for debate. But I mean, what a cracking first fight, and one that stylistically I can't see too much changing. And I'm just ready for an all-out brawl again, really.
Yeah, I think don't see like too much of what. Yeah, I think it will probably be a fairly similar fight to the first one. Maybe it's just me, but in my head, I don't see how Moreno could take the same damage that he did in the first fight. Like the man is ungodly tough, but I just don't see how that lasts. Like Figueiredo has proved to be like a very dangerous puncher at 125 and one of the most reliable finishers in that division, from either knockouts or submissions. So it'll be interesting to see if Moreno can hold up in that regard. And it will also be interesting to see kind of if he can build off the success he had in the first fight. I thought the fight was competitive, competitive, but not necessarily. I thought it was fairly simple to score. I don't know why it got a draw.
I think it was mainly that Figueiredo point deduction that added some elements of confusion.
Yeah, but even then, I thought the only round I'd really give Moreno would be the fourth. Outside of that, I think it's difficult to give him around. Like I think DC said on like the broadcast, he like thought Moreno won the second from the takedowns or something, but like when he took Figueiredo down, he didn't really do any damage with it, and mostly just 8 elbows from Figueiredo off his back. So I think that it's difficult to score those takedowns kind of as a win for Moreno in a sense, to give him those rounds. So the only round I'd confidently give Moreno would have been the fourth. But he did have success in that fourth and quite a lot of it. He hurt Figueiredo fairly badly. I think with a head kick, and like he had success kind of pushing forward and mixing combinations to the body and to the head. So kind of with that success that he had, I'll be interested to see what he can build off that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that assessment. I think, if Figueiredo doesn't get a point deduction, he clearly wins that. And I think there's, as you said, I think there's ways that Figueiredo can get better in that fight, get a bit smarter. I just don't. I think maybe Moreno can obviously make adjustments, but I think a lot of his fighting style is just embracing that chaos, and I don't know to what extent he can max that out any further against a guy who is just hits like an absolute truck at 125. So it will be interesting to see if there's any stylistic changes from either fighter. I think if you're most likely to see if it's most likely to end in a different way, it has to be from Moreno. But I don't know if a different style particularly enhances his chances of winning. But then conversely, I don't think I don't think him continuing that same style is likely to merit or likely to bring about a victory. So it is tricky for him. I can just see Figueiredo just being a bit smarter and just continuing to use those skills that almost got him the win the first time around, and just sort of securing it the second time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that Figueiredo he did come out not kind of setting his shots up as much as I think he usually does, maybe in that first fight. So I think like with that kind of like adaptation, he can probably have more offensive success. I mean, like saying that, like he absolutely brutalized Moreno, I think, in the first fight. So it's difficult to say he needs more offensive success. It was just Moreno was ungodly tough and was able to push through and then fight back. But even with that, Moreno having his best round in the fourth, Figueiredo came out in the fifth and really re-established himself and didn't let Moreno build on the success he had in the previous round. So I think that is encouraging that Figueiredo didn't fade, because it's always kind of a worry with a guy that's as kind of explosive as Figueiredo is. He's like a mini Romero, and like we've seen, say, like in the first Whittaker fight, if Romero goes out trying to finish you and goes out putting out a high pace, he will fade. But Figueiredo didn't, which is quite encouraging. And the fight was a torrid pace, so there's no worries in that regard for Figueiredo. So I think I can see Figueiredo doing largely what he did in the first fight, and I would imagine this time finishing Moreno. But if he doesn't, all credit to Moreno, because that's crazy.
Yeah, I think regardless of predictions and analysis, I think the one thing is for certain is that this one, hopefully, I mean, I said hopefully as if I've just said surely and then hopefully, but it can't disappoint. It now will, but
I can't see it. It just the way they fight, the way they match up, just like screams kind of fireworks pretty much every time.
Let's hope for that. Okay, main event time. Israel Adesanya, Marvin Vettori. Adesanya coming back down to 185 after his unsuccessful venture at light heavyweight. Obviously lost to Jan Blachowicz, still undefeated at middleweight. And he fights Marvin Vettori, whose last loss actually was a split decision against Israel Adesanya in 2018. He is on an impressive 5-fight win streak with wins over Jack Hermansson and Kevin Holland most recently. Seems to have got this as a sort of byproduct of Robert Whittaker, and Adesanya's schedule is not really matching up. But
yeah,
you can't say that he doesn't represent probably the second most deserving person to step up and challenge Adesanya. I mean, path to victory for Vettori seems difficult in terms of his style feels like one that feeds into a slick, well, does not feed well into a fight against a slick, fast moving counterpuncher like Adesanya. Um, is there any route for victory? I mean, perhaps sort of following a Blachowicz-esque takedown route seems like a possibility, but if he's sort of at his plodding 1-2 normal best, I don't feel like that's going to be enough.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough. Vettori in his recent fights has mostly been has been a kind of like pressure, put his opponents back to the cage, and then, especially against Holland, but it is Kevin Holland, against Holland was and then work that into like clinch takedowns against the cage, kind of stuff like that. So it is to really get his game going. It is, which is a very bully-ish kind of like physical game. He wants to really kind of like put his hands on you, get it really like physical. He's going to need to find a way to consistently pressure Adesanya, which we've seen is very difficult because Adesanya's ring craft is amongst the best in the sport. And I think Vettori has improved in that regard recently, but I don't think enough. So I think it's going to be tough to get that regular game going. But I think there are attributes Vettori has, and there are things he can probably learn from the Blachowicz fight that he can use. I think that Blachowicz did a good job of essentially just not letting Adesanya build by being very defensively responsible. Like, he checked all of Adesanya's kicks, or not all of them, but most of the kicks. Didn't let him build off those, which is like one of Adesanya's favorite. It's the jab and the low kick, build up everything else essentially. And Blachowicz denied that by checking the kicks and then being able to kind of like counter off of the jab. And I think that's something Vettori can do. He's very durable, very tough. So I think if he is eating jabs from Adesanya and Adesanya wants to build off of that and add, say, another shot behind it, he can just use the jab as kind of like a trigger for his own counters. And then he's got fairly decent kick defense as well. So yeah, I think like that's a little bit there that he can work with.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that. I mean, and there is the intangible, which we cannot offer an insight into how much this is a thing, but it is Adesanya's first fight since his first loss. I don't know how much that'll play a factor in it. It didn't seem in the post fight even that he was particularly. It wasn't a thing that bugged him. But psychologically, if Vettori can have a good first round, take him down, maybe win that first round, you never know whether that sort of bravado might give way to some sort of self-doubt. That is a complete intangible that is impossible to know until potentially it happens.
Yeah, I think kind of like seizing on that, that's like it is an intangible, but it is a very good, like, it is very relevant, I think, especially if Vettori can like snatch an early round. And as I said, Vettori is very durable, so I don't really see Adesanya getting a easy finish here, which means that I think this fight is going to go late. And if Vettori could snatch an early round and then it's going into the fourth and it's competitive going into the fifth, I think it will weigh on Adesanya's mind, who I think as a fighter isn't necessarily as confident as he wants everyone to think he is, if that makes sense. I think he does, to a degree, he does have some kind of like self-doubts like in the midst of it. So yeah, I think if Vettori can extend him like that, I think it'll be interesting to see how Adesanya reacts, because that was similar to the Blachowicz fight. like competitive early rounds, followed by Blachowicz able to snatch it late. And as Adesanya kind of like, as the fight kind of wears on, Vettori will not fade. Like we've seen that's part of him. He mentally, physically will not give up, basically. He will keep trying, like, no matter how much like it might not be working, he will keep kind of like going back and keep trying. So going late, as Adesanya gets tired, I think his takedown defense doesn't quite stand up to kind of like the level it is early on. So maybe then late on is the kind of like route in for the wrestling to start working if Vettori can make the early rounds kind of competitive on the feet, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think another thing, I mentioned briefly, 2018, they did have a split decision. I know that was three years ago, but this is a guy that on one of the three judges scorecards did beat Adesanya, and that has got to maybe doesn't play on Adesanya's mind, but in terms of Vettori, if you think about his mindset, this is a guy that in his mind maybe he thought he won that 2018 fight. I can't remember it too well off the top of my head.
I think it was a fairly poor decision. Like I think it was quite clear that Adesanya won, yeah. But like still like. As a fighter, you seize on anything you can, like the mental victory, like, and he can play that up in his mind. I don't think that will play on Adesanya's mind because I think realistically he knows that he comfortably won. But I think even like the Blachowicz fight, as you mentioned earlier, will probably have a bigger kind of effect coming in for Adesanya. But no, despite that, it was a fairly like competitive fight, and Vettori definitely kind of had his moments, and definitely Adesanya couldn't build into that fight, or wasn't as offensively dangerous as he was against a lot of the other opponents early in his UFC career. So it's interesting. But yeah, I think like we have focused a lot on what Vettori can do as a path to victory, and that's because really it does not heavily but fairly comfortably favor Adesanya.
Yeah, I think if he gets the best of his game plan going, I can't see a way in which he doesn't get the job done. But that's not often the way these things goes, and I'm sure there'll be more adversity than what potentially meets the eye. I mean, I think that, and unless you have any other sort of thoughts that you wanted to mention.
No, nothing springs to mind.
Well, I think that basically draws our sort of preview to a close. I mean, there's a lot of fights you talked about there, a lot of interesting fights on the card, and certainly something we will look back on next week, hopefully. I mean, we'll be back to review that. We'll look ahead to the card happening next weekend, which is headlined by Korean Zombie Dan Ige. There's not a whole lot on there, but there's Danny Roberts, Tim Means, Marlon Vera, David Grant, couple bits of British interest there.
I didn't even know that fight card was really well. I assumed there was one, but I had no idea of what the fights on there were. So, but no, that sounds okay.
Yeah, and we've got fight card after that, and then we're straight into Poirier McGregor 3 in 3 weeks' time, which feels crazy to say, but yeah, we'll save much of that discussion for next week. And yeah, stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you then.
See ya.